In the rolling countryside of South Carolina stood a plantation that guarded a secret so peculiar, so deliberate, it would baffle historians for generations. For 4 decades, a single bed in the eastern wing lay untouched, never slept in, never made, never acknowledged by anyone within those walls. The family who owned the property went to extraordinary lengths to keep this room hidden from visitors, servants, and anyone who might ask questions. What they didn't know was that their silence would eventually speak louder than any confession ever could. Before we continue with the story of the Harrington family and their inexplicable obsession with an empty room, if you're new to Liturgy of Fear, please subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. This is a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the families that shaped American history. The Harrington Plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of prime agricultural land in Beaufort County, South Carolina. The main house, built in 1789, was a testament to the prosperity that slavery had afforded the family. A 3-story federal-style mansion with white columns that caught the afternoon light like teeth in a smile. The grounds were meticulously maintained, gardens arranged in geometric precision, slave quarters set in neat rows at a distance that rendered them invisible from the main house, and a network of outbuildings serving every function a self-sufficient estate required. The family itself was unremarkable in most respects. Thomas Harrington had inherited the plantation from his father in 1801 when he was just 23. A man of moderate temperament, he was known in the county for fair dealings with merchants and his participation in the local militia. His wife Eleanor came from a family of equal standing, the Carpenters, whose own plantation lay 30 miles to the north. They married in 1802, a union less about passion than the consolidation of land and influence. By 1810, Thomas and Eleanor had 3 children, William, born in 1803, Catherine, born in 1805, and James, born in 1808. The family appeared to be exactly what a prosperous planter's household should be: stable, productive, and thoroughly embedded in the social fabric of the Lowcountry. Thomas employed approximately 120 enslaved people on the plantation, a number that placed him among the wealthier planters in the region, though not among the absolute elite. The eastern wing of the main house had been added in 1795, a decade before Thomas inherited the property. It contained 6 bedrooms arranged along a long hallway that received light from tall windows overlooking the gardens. 5 of these rooms were used regularly. The 6th, at the far end of the corridor, was not. No one could later recall exactly when the room became forbidden. The servants who worked in the house, and there were always several who lived in the quarters attached to the main residence, spoke of it only in whispers, and only when certain no Harrington family member could hear. The room had a bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and a small fireplace, all suggesting it had been prepared for habitation. Yet in the memory of the oldest servants, it had never been occupied. The peculiarity of the room was not that it was locked. Many rooms in plantation houses were locked to prevent theft or unauthorized use, but that the Harringtons had taken extraordinary measures to ensure no one would think to ask about it. Visitors were never shown the eastern wing. If a guest required lodging, they were directed to rooms in the main part of the house or to the guest cottage near the entrance. The servants who cleaned the eastern wing were instructed to do so only when the family was away, and they were told never to speak of what they found there. What they found in those rare moments when they were permitted to enter was a room frozen in time. The bed was made with sheets never slept upon. The wardrobe held clothing never worn. The writing desk contained no papers, no letters, no evidence of human activity whatsoever. It was as if the room existed in a state of perpetual readiness for someone who would never arrive. Eleanor Harrington was the keeper of this secret. It was she who gave the orders about the room, she who ensured the servants understood the absolute necessity of their silence, and she who, on the rare occasion someone asked about the eastern wing, would smile tightly and change the subject with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing so for years. The other members of the family, Thomas, William, Catherine, and James, seemed to accept the existence of the forbidden room without question. They did not enter it. They did not speak of it. They did not acknowledge it in any way that might suggest it held significance. And yet the room remained, year after year, a silent presence in the house, like a held breath that never quite escaped. The explanation for the room's existence, when it finally emerged, came not from the Harringtons themselves, but from a letter that arrived in the spring of 1811. Addressed to Thomas Harrington, it came from a Virginia town few in South Carolina had heard of. The handwriting was careful, educated, and bore the marks of someone who had taken great pains to compose the message with precision. Thomas read the letter in his study, and when he emerged, his face carried a peculiar expression, something between resignation and dread. He called Eleanor into the room and closed the door. The servants heard raised voices, though not the words themselves. When Eleanor emerged an hour later, her composure was intact, but her eyes suggested something fundamental had shifted. Within a month, a carriage arrived at the Harrington plantation bearing a young woman. She was perhaps 20, with dark hair and features bearing an unmistakable resemblance to Thomas Harrington. Her name was Margaret, and she was, as Thomas would later explain to Eleanor in a conversation the servants pieced together from fragments overheard through walls and doorways, his daughter. The existence of Margaret was not entirely a shock to Eleanor. Thomas had, before their marriage, lived a life not entirely without incident. There had been a woman in Charleston, a woman of mixed race, who had borne him a child. Thomas had made arrangements for the child's care, financial arrangements, the kind not uncommon among men of his station. The woman had died when Margaret was an infant, and the child had been raised by relatives in Virginia, far from South Carolina and the life Thomas had built with Eleanor. But now Margaret had come to the plantation, and she could not simply be sent away. She was, after all, Thomas's daughter, and there were certain obligations even a man as careful about his reputation as Thomas Harrington could not entirely ignore. Yet she could not be acknowledged as a member of the family, not in a society where her mixed heritage would make her an impossible embarrassment, not in a household where Eleanor's position as the legitimate wife and mother had to be maintained without question. The solution was the room in the eastern wing. Margaret was installed there, given a life that was neither that of a family member nor that of a servant. She was not permitted to eat with the family, not permitted to appear in the public rooms, not permitted to attend church or be seen in town. She was, for all practical purposes, a ghost, present in the house but invisible to the world beyond. The servants were instructed that Margaret was a distant relative who had come to stay temporarily, that she was in delicate health and required quiet and solitude, and that any discussion of her presence would result in severe punishment. Some servants understood the truth immediately, others constructed their own explanations, stories perhaps less accurate but no less damaging to Margaret's dignity. Margaret herself accepted her confinement with a resignation suggesting she had expected nothing better. Raised in poverty and obscurity, the Harrington plantation, for all its restrictions, offered a level of material comfort she had never known. She had a room of her own, adequate food, books, which she read voraciously, and a writing desk for letters that were never sent. The 1810s passed, and Margaret remained in her room. She was 21, then 25, then 30. The world beyond the plantation changed. The War of 1812 came and went. The cotton gin transformed the Southern economy. The enslaved population of the Harrington plantation grew as Thomas invested more heavily in cotton cultivation. The family's wealth increased, and with it their social standing in the county. Eleanor bore Thomas 2 more children, a daughter named Susan in 1812 and a son named Robert in 1815. These children grew up in a household where the eastern wing was simply not discussed, where visitors were never shown that part of the house, where the servants had learned to move through the corridors as if that entire section did not exist. Margaret watched her half-siblings grow from the windows of her room. She saw William become a young man, ride out on horseback in the mornings, return in the evenings with the confidence of someone who belonged entirely to the world denied to her. She saw Catherine blossom into a young woman, dressed in the finest fabrics, attended by servants who brought her tea and helped her into her gowns. She saw James and Susan and Robert grow and change, and she remained always in her room. The room became a kind of prison, but of a particular sort. Margaret was not locked in. The door had no lock on the outside. She was free to leave whenever she wished, but to leave would be to expose herself, to invite the inevitable questions, to risk the anger of Thomas and Eleanor, and to lose the only security she had ever known. So she remained. The servants who brought her meals, rotated regularly so no one person would become too familiar with her, reported that she was quiet, did not complain, and seemed to accept her situation with stoic resignation. Some felt pity for her, others felt nothing at all, a few perhaps felt a kind of contempt, as if her confinement reflected her own inadequacy rather than a deliberate choice by the family that had brought her there. Thomas Harrington, for his part, seemed to have largely forgotten about Margaret. He did not visit her room, inquire about her welfare, or acknowledge her existence in any way that might suggest she held any claim on his attention or affection. By refusing to acknowledge her, he could convince himself she did not exist, that the decision to bring her to the plantation and confine her to a single room was not a decision at all, but simply the natural order of things. Eleanor, by contrast, seemed to take grim satisfaction in Margaret's confinement. She ensured the rules governing Margaret's isolation were strictly enforced. She decided what Margaret would eat, what books she would be permitted to read, what supplies she would be allowed. And when Margaret's presence threatened to become visible, when a servant spoke too freely, when a visitor came too close to the eastern wing, Eleanor took swift and decisive action to restore the silence. In the spring of 1825, something happened that nearly exposed the secret. A traveling physician came to attend to Eleanor, who had fallen ill with a fever. Dr. Nathaniel Prescott was a man of some education and considerable curiosity. Trained in Philadelphia, he had traveled extensively throughout the South and developed a reputation for asking questions beyond the purely medical. Dr. Prescott spent 3 days at the plantation, observing the household with the careful attention of a man who understood that families often contained hidden complexities. He noted the unusual arrangement of the house, the deliberate avoidance of certain areas, the peculiar behavior of some servants when they thought they were not being observed. On his final evening, as he prepared to depart the next morning, he asked Thomas Harrington a seemingly innocent question. He had noticed, he said, that the eastern wing seemed unoccupied. Was there some reason it was not being used? A structural problem making it unsuitable? Thomas Harrington's response was immediate and emphatic. The eastern wing, he said, was perfectly suitable for habitation. The family simply had no need for additional bedrooms at present. The rooms were maintained in good condition, available should they ever be required. There was nothing unusual. Many large houses had rooms not in constant use. Dr. Prescott accepted this explanation but did not seem entirely satisfied. He asked a follow-up question. Had he perhaps heard voices coming from that part of the house during the night? Unable to sleep, he explained, he had been walking the corridors and thought he heard someone moving about in the eastern wing. Thomas's face went very still. He said quietly that Dr. Prescott must have been mistaken. There was no one in the eastern wing. The sounds were likely the house settling or wind moving through the corridors. Old houses made many sounds at night. It was easy to misinterpret them. That night, Eleanor called for the servants who attended to Margaret. She instructed them that Margaret was to remain absolutely silent from that moment forward. If Dr. Prescott heard any sound whatsoever from the eastern wing, the consequences would be severe, not just for Margaret, but for every servant in the house. Eleanor's voice was cold and precise, and the servants understood she meant exactly what she said. Dr. Prescott departed the next morning without further incident. But the episode had shaken something loose. For the first time, the secret of Margaret's existence had come close to being exposed, and the family's response, the swift, decisive action taken by Eleanor, the fear that rippled through the servants, suggested the secret was worth protecting at almost any cost. As the years continued to pass, Margaret remained in her room. She was now in her 30s, and the world beyond had changed dramatically. The cotton economy boomed, and with it the demand for enslaved labor increased exponentially. The Harrington plantation grew to nearly 2,000 acres, and the number of enslaved people working the land increased to more than 300. The family's wealth multiplied many times over. But Margaret's situation had not changed. She remained confined to her room, invisible to the world, acknowledged by no one, claimed by no one. The servants who had known her when she first arrived had grown old, been sold, or died. New servants came to the plantation and were told the same story. The eastern wing was not to be discussed, visitors were not to be shown that part of the house. Any servant who spoke of what they might have seen or heard there would face severe punishment. Some of the newer servants did not even know Margaret existed. They simply understood that certain parts of the house were forbidden, and they did not question why. The mystery of the eastern wing became an accepted fact of life on the plantation. William Harrington, Thomas's eldest son, had grown into a man and taken over much of the plantation's management. He married Caroline, the daughter of a neighboring planter, and they began to have children. William seemed to have inherited his father's capacity for not seeing what he did not wish to see. He never mentioned the Eastern Wing, never asked about Margaret, and accepted without question that certain parts of the family's life were simply not discussed. Catherine had married and moved away to Charleston with a merchant son. James had become involved in the militia, developing a reputation as a man of strong opinions about the proper order of society. Susan and Robert had grown into adulthood and begun establishing their own lives, though they remained closely connected to the plantation and the family's interests. Yet the question of Margaret's existence hung over the household like a cloud no one acknowledged but everyone could feel. The servants knew, the family knew, and Margaret herself knew, but no one spoke of it. No one asked the questions that would naturally arise. Why was she there? How long would she remain? What would become of her? The silence surrounding Margaret had become so complete, so absolute, it had taken on a kind of weight. It was as if the family had collectively decided that by refusing to acknowledge her existence, they could somehow make her cease to exist. But Margaret remained, year after year, a living contradiction to this fiction. In 1835, a distant cousin of Eleanor's came to visit. Her name was Harriet, a widow who had recently lost her husband and was traveling to visit relatives to distract herself from her grief. Harriet was a woman of considerable intelligence and even more considerable curiosity. She had read widely, traveled extensively, and developed a habit of observing the world with a sharp and critical eye. During her stay, Harriet noticed the same things Dr. Prescott had noticed years before: the unusual arrangement of the house, the avoidance of certain areas, the peculiar behavior of the servants. But unlike Dr. Prescott, Harriet was not content to accept the explanations offered. She was family, after all, and family had certain privileges. One afternoon, when Eleanor was resting, Harriet asked Thomas directly about the Eastern Wing. It seemed entirely unused, she said. Was there some reason? Had the family considered converting it into additional guest rooms? It seemed a waste of perfectly good space. Thomas gave her the same explanation he had given Dr. Prescott: the rooms were maintained but not needed. There was nothing unusual. But Harriet was not satisfied. She pressed further. Might she see the rooms? She was curious about the architecture. The Eastern Wing had been added at a different time than the main structure, and she was interested in how the two had been joined. Thomas was forced to refuse. The rooms, he said, were not in a state suitable for visitors. They were being used for storage, quite dusty and disorganized. It would not be appropriate for a guest to see them in such condition. This explanation was so obviously false that Harriet did not bother to pretend belief. She looked at Thomas for a long moment and then said, "There is someone in those rooms, isn't there? Someone you do not wish anyone to know about." Thomas's face went pale. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "That is not a question you should ask, Harriet. And it is certainly not a question I am prepared to answer." Harriet understood she had stumbled upon something significant. She did not press further, but neither did she let the matter rest entirely. Over the following days, she observed the household more carefully than ever, noticing the servants with specific duties related to the Eastern Wing, the way Eleanor's jaw tightened whenever it was mentioned, the peculiar silence surrounding that part of the house. On her final evening, Harriet asked to speak with Eleanor privately. The two women sat in the parlor, and Harriet said, "I know there is someone in the Eastern Wing. I do not know who, and I do not know why, but I want you to know that I have seen the signs and understood what they mean." Eleanor's response was cold and measured. "What you have understood, Harriet, is that there are certain matters not appropriate for discussion. I trust you will respect the privacy of this family and not speak of what you think you have observed to anyone else. If you do, I can assure you the consequences will be severe, not just for you, but for your reputation and for the reputation of your family as well." Harriet left the next morning. She did not speak of what she had discovered, not because she feared Eleanor's threats, but because she understood that to do so would expose a secret that once exposed could not be contained. Whatever was happening in the eastern wing of the Harrington plantation was a matter the family had decided to keep hidden, and Harriet was not the kind of woman to deliberately cause such disruption. But she did write a letter to a close friend, a letter sealed and marked to be opened only after her death. In it, she described what she had observed and expressed her conviction that there was a person, likely a woman, confined to the eastern wing. She suspected it had something to do with the family's honor or reputation. The letter was placed in a box with Harriet's other papers and forgotten. As the 1830s progressed, the question of Margaret's status grew increasingly complicated. She was now in her 40s, having spent nearly her entire adult life confined to a single room. She had never married, never had children, never experienced any of the things a woman her age might reasonably have expected. But more importantly, her existence posed a legal and social problem the Harrington family could not entirely ignore. Thomas Harrington was growing older, and his will would eventually need to be settled. The question of Margaret's status, whether she was a member of the family or not, would inevitably arise. Thomas had never formally acknowledged Margaret as his daughter. To do so would admit to a relationship that had produced a child of mixed race, an admission that would have been socially catastrophic. But neither had he entirely disowned her. He had brought her to the plantation, ensured she was cared for, and in his own way taken responsibility for her existence. The ambiguity of Margaret's status created a kind of legal limbo. She was not enslaved, the family had never claimed that, and to do so would expose the secret to the broader community, but neither was she free in any meaningful sense. She could not leave the plantation without permission, could not own property, could not enter contracts, could not marry. She existed in a state with no legal name, in a category the law did not recognize. This ambiguity became the subject of careful consideration by Thomas and Eleanor, and later by William, as the question of what would happen to Margaret after Thomas's death grew pressing. If Margaret were to be freed upon Thomas's death, she would need to be acknowledged as his daughter, and the reason for her confinement would become public knowledge. If she were to remain confined, the family would need to ensure whoever inherited the plantation would maintain the secret and continue her care. These were not questions that could be discussed openly. They were discussed in whispers, in private conversations, in letters carefully worded to avoid explicit acknowledgement. But they were discussed, and the family understood a decision would eventually need to be made. Thomas Harrington died in the winter of 1840 at age 62. He had been ill for months, and his death was not entirely unexpected. The family gathered for the funeral, and the community mourned the passing of one of the most prominent men in the county. Thomas's will was read by the family's lawyer, Samuel Whitfield, who had served the Harringtons for more than 30 years. The will was lengthy and detailed, as the wills of wealthy men tend to be. It divided the plantation among Thomas's legitimate children, William, Catherine, James, Susan, and Robert. It made provisions for Eleanor, ensuring she would be cared for. It made bequests to various charitable institutions and to the church. But it made no mention of Margaret. This silence was in its own way more eloquent than any explicit statement. Thomas had chosen not to acknowledge Margaret in his will, not to free her, not to provide for her, not to recognize her existence in any legal document. The implication was clear: Margaret was to remain in the eastern wing, and the family was to continue the fiction that she did not exist. But the will also contained an unusual clause that would later prove significant. It stated that William, as the eldest son and primary heir, was to be executor of the estate and have full authority over all matters related to the property and its management. This included, the will stated, all matters of a private or confidential nature that may have been entrusted to my care during my lifetime. Vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways, it was clear enough to those who understood that William was to be responsible for maintaining the secret of Margaret's existence and ensuring her continued care. William accepted this responsibility without apparent hesitation. He was now master of the Harrington plantation, and he seemed to understand that maintaining the family's reputation depended upon continued silence about Margaret. The 1840s and 1850s passed, and Margaret remained in her room. She was now in her 50s, and the world beyond had changed dramatically. The nation was moving toward civil war. Slavery had become the central political issue of the age. Abolitionists in the North called for its immediate end, while slaveholders in the South defended it as necessary and even beneficial. The Harrington family, like most planter families, was deeply invested in the continuation of slavery. Their wealth, power, and entire way of life depended upon the labor of enslaved people. William Harrington had grown increasingly vocal in his defense of slavery, taking a leadership role in the local militia being organized for possible armed conflict. But even as he defended slavery as an institution, he continued to maintain the secret of Margaret's confinement. The contradiction between his public positions and private actions was not something he seemed to recognize or be troubled by. Margaret was not enslaved, he would have said if asked. She was a member of the family, albeit one whose existence was not to be publicly acknowledged. That she was confined to a single room, not permitted to leave the plantation, had no legal rights, and no control over her own life, these things did not, in William's mind, constitute slavery. Margaret herself seemed to have accepted her fate with resignation bordering on indifference. She was now an old woman, and the possibility of escape or significant change in her circumstances seemed long past. She spent her days reading, writing letters never sent, and looking from her window at the world she could see but never touch. The servants who attended her had changed many times. Some felt pity, others felt nothing at all. But all understood they were to maintain absolute silence. The secret of the Eastern Wing had become so deeply embedded in the plantation's culture that it seemed almost natural, almost inevitable, that there should be a room never used, a person never acknowledged, a part of the family never mentioned. In 1858, a young man named Thomas Harrington, Jr., William's eldest son, came of age and began taking on more responsibilities in the plantation's management. Thomas Jr. was intelligent, educated, and ambitious. He had attended a prestigious academy in Charleston and traveled to Philadelphia and New York, exposing him to ideas and perspectives uncommon in the South Carolina Lowcountry. One day, while reviewing household accounts, Thomas Jr. noticed something unusual: regular expenses related to the Eastern Wing, food, candles, firewood, repairs and maintenance. These expenses had been ongoing for decades and were substantial. Yet, as far as Thomas Jr. could tell, the Eastern Wing was not being used. He asked his father about these expenses. William's response was evasive: the rooms were being maintained in case they were ever needed. It was important to keep the house in good condition. The expenses were not significant in the context of the family's overall wealth. But Thomas Jr. was not satisfied. He pressed further. He asked to see the Eastern Wing. If the rooms were being maintained, he should be familiar with them, as he would eventually manage the plantation. William refused. The Eastern Wing was not suitable for visitors, he said, and Thomas Jr. should not concern himself with that part of the house. There were other matters requiring his attention. This refusal only increased Thomas Jr.'s curiosity. He began asking servants questions, carefully, indirectly, trying to understand what was happening. Some refused to answer, others gave vague, contradictory responses. But gradually a picture emerged: there was someone in the Eastern Wing, someone who had been there a very long time, someone whose existence was supposed to be kept secret. Thomas Jr. did not immediately confront his father. Instead, he observed more carefully, noticing the servants with duties related to the Eastern Wing, the way his father's expression changed whenever it was mentioned, the peculiar silence surrounding that part of the house. Then one evening, while walking in the corridor near the Eastern Wing, he heard something, a woman's voice singing softly. The song was old, sung in a minor key, filled with a melancholy that spoke of loss and longing. Thomas Jr. stood and listened until it faded away. In that moment, he understood: there was indeed someone in the Eastern Wing, someone who had been there a very long time, someone the family had kept hidden. The next morning, Thomas Jr. confronted his father. He asked directly, who was in the Eastern Wing, and why were they being kept hidden? William's response was to become very angry. He told Thomas Jr. that certain matters were not appropriate for discussion, that the Eastern Wing was not his concern, and that he was to stop asking questions about it immediately. If he continued to press the matter, William said, there would be consequences. But Thomas Jr. was not intimidated. He was a man of the 19th century, educated and exposed to new ideas. He could not accept that a person could be confined to a single room for decades without explanation or justification. He demanded to know the truth. Finally, after years of silence, William told him. Margaret was Thomas Jr.'s half-sister, the daughter of Thomas Jr.'s grandfather and a woman of mixed race. She had been brought to the plantation decades ago and confined to the eastern wing because her existence threatened the family's reputation and social standing. To acknowledge her would be to admit to a relationship that had produced a child of mixed race, an admission that would have been socially catastrophic. Thomas Jr. listened in silence. When his father finished, he asked a simple question: "Is she free?" William did not answer immediately. Finally, he said, "She is not enslaved, if that is what you are asking. But neither is she free in any meaningful sense. She cannot leave the plantation without our permission. She cannot own property. She cannot marry. She exists in a state that has no legal name." "Then she is a prisoner," Thomas Jr. said. "She is a member of this family," William replied. "And she is being cared for. That is all that matters." But Thomas Jr. did not accept this answer. He said he wanted to meet Margaret, to speak with her, to understand her situation for himself. William refused. Such a meeting, he said, would be inappropriate, would only upset Margaret, and would serve no purpose. The situation was what it was and had been for decades. There was no point in changing it now. But Thomas Jr. was determined. He waited until his father was away, then went to the eastern wing. He knocked on Margaret's door. When there was no response, he opened it and entered. Margaret was sitting by the window, looking out at the gardens. She was an old woman now, in her 60s, her hair turned white, her face lined, her eyes holding a quality of deep sadness suggesting a lifetime of disappointment and loss. When Thomas Jr. entered, she did not seem surprised. She turned and said, "You are William's son." "I am," Thomas Jr. replied. "And you are my half-sister?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I am," she said, "though I have never been acknowledged as such." Thomas Jr. sat in a chair near the window, and they talked for hours. Margaret told him about her life, her childhood in Virginia, her mother's death, her arrival at the plantation, the decades spent in this room. She spoke without bitterness, with a weary acceptance suggesting she had made peace with her situation long ago. Thomas Jr. asked if she wanted to leave, if she wanted to be free. Margaret considered the question for a long time. "I am 63 years old," she said finally. "I have no family outside this house. I have no skills that would allow me to support myself. I have no connections in the world. If I were to leave, I would have nowhere to go and no way to survive. So, no, I do not want to leave. But I would like to be acknowledged. I would like to be treated as a member of this family rather than as a secret that must be hidden." Thomas Jr. promised to work to change the situation, to speak to his father and convince him that Margaret should be acknowledged and treated with the respect she deserved. But when he spoke to his father, William refused. To acknowledge Margaret, he said, would expose the family to ridicule and scandal. The situation was what it was and could not be changed without destroying the family's reputation. Thomas Jr. was frustrated but not entirely surprised. He understood his father was a man of his time, shaped by the values and prejudices of the society in which he lived. To ask him to acknowledge Margaret would be to ask him to go against everything he had been taught about honor, reputation, and social standing. In 1861, the Civil War began. The Harrington Plantation, like all Southern plantations, was affected. Young men from the family and surrounding community went off to fight. Resources were diverted to support the war effort. Enslaved people began to escape, seeking freedom with advancing Union armies. William Harrington died in 1863, killed in a skirmish near Charleston. Thomas Jr. inherited the plantation and with it the responsibility for maintaining the secret of Margaret's existence. But the war had changed everything. The social order that had made Margaret's confinement possible was collapsing. The institution of slavery, the foundation of Southern society, was being destroyed. The values and beliefs that had seemed so absolute and unchangeable were being questioned and challenged. In 1865, the Civil War ended. The South was defeated, slavery abolished. The Harrington Plantation, like all Southern plantations, lay in ruins. The enslaved people who had worked the land were now free. The family's wealth was decimated. The social order that had sustained their power and prestige was destroyed. And yet Margaret remained in the Eastern Wing. She was now in her 70s, and the world had changed so dramatically that the reasons for her confinement seemed almost incomprehensible. But the family's commitment to maintaining the secret of her existence remained unchanged. Thomas Jr., now master of the plantation, faced a choice. He could acknowledge Margaret, treat her as a member of the family, give her the recognition she had been denied for so long. Or he could continue to maintain the fiction that she did not exist, continue to confine her to her room, continue to pretend the secret was still worth protecting. In the end, Thomas Jr. chose to maintain the secret. He told himself Margaret was old, content in her room, and that exposing her to the world at this late stage would only cause suffering. But the truth was more complicated. The secret of Margaret's existence had become so deeply embedded in the family's identity, so much a part of how they understood themselves, that to expose it would be to expose something fundamental about their nature and values. Margaret died in 1872 at the age of 81. She had spent 51 years in the eastern wing of the Harrington plantation, confined to a single room, hidden from the world, denied the recognition and acknowledgement she deserved. When she died, the family faced a question: what should be done with her body? To give her a proper funeral would expose the secret of her existence. To bury her in the family cemetery would acknowledge her as a member of the family. To dispose of her body in secret would treat her as if she had never existed at all. In the end, the family chose a middle path. Margaret was buried in a small cemetery on the edge of the plantation, her grave marked with a simple stone bearing only her name and the dates of her birth and death. No one was told about the burial. No one was invited to attend. The grave was left unmarked in the family's records, and the secret of Margaret's existence was maintained, even in death. After Margaret's death, the eastern wing fell into disuse. The room where she had spent so many years was closed up, furniture covered with sheets, windows shuttered. The room became, in effect, a tomb, a space that existed but was not acknowledged, a room never entered, a part of the house never discussed. It was not until 1912, 40 years after Margaret's death, that the secret of the eastern wing was finally exposed. By then, Thomas Jr. had died, and the plantation had passed to his son, Thomas Harrington III. Thomas III had grown up hearing vague references to the eastern wing but had never been told the full story of Margaret's confinement. In 1912, a fire broke out in the main house. While fighting the fire and assessing the damage, workers discovered the sealed room in the eastern wing. They found the bed still made with sheets never slept upon, the wardrobe still containing clothing never worn, the writing desk still empty of papers or letters. And they found something else, a journal hidden beneath the floorboards. The journal had been written by Margaret, containing a detailed account of her life in the eastern wing, her thoughts and feelings, her hopes and disappointments, her slow acceptance of her fate. Discovered by a worker named James, it was brought to Thomas Harrington III, who read it and learned the full story of his half-aunt's confinement, her life before the plantation, her arrival, the decades hidden away, her conversations with Thomas Jr., her slow decline into old age. Thomas III faced a choice: destroy the journal and maintain the family's secret, or allow the truth to be known. In the end, he chose to allow the truth to be known. He gave the journal to a historian researching the history of the Lowcountry, and the story of Margaret's confinement was finally exposed. The revelation shocked the community and the nation. Here was a story that seemed to encapsulate everything wrong with the Old South: the hypocrisy, the cruelty, the willingness to deny the humanity of those who did not fit into a family's carefully constructed image of respectability. But the story also raised questions that could not be easily answered. Why had the family gone to such extraordinary lengths to maintain the secret? What did it say about the values and beliefs of a society that would require such deception? How many other secrets like this one were hidden behind the closed doors of southern plantations? The eastern wing of the Harrington plantation was eventually restored, and the room where Margaret had spent so many years was preserved as a memorial. Visitors could see the room, the bed never slept in, read the journal Margaret had written, and understand in some small way what it meant to be hidden away, denied recognition, treated as a secret rather than a person. But the room itself remained in many ways a mystery. The reasons for Margaret's confinement, the family's commitment to maintaining the secret, the psychological impact of decades of isolation, these things could be understood intellectually but never fully comprehended. The room stood as a testament to the human capacity to deny reality, to maintain fictions in the face of overwhelming evidence, to prioritize reputation and social standing over the basic dignity and humanity of another person. And the question haunting everyone who learned the story remained unanswered: how many other rooms like this existed? How many other people had been hidden away, confined to single spaces, denied the recognition and acknowledgement they deserved? How many other secrets were waiting to be discovered, hidden behind the closed doors of grand houses and respectable families? The story of Margaret Harrington and the room in the Eastern Wing became, in the end, not just one woman's story of confinement, but a window into the hidden darkness beneath the surface of American society, a darkness all the more terrifying because it was so ordinary, so human, so entirely explicable by the values and beliefs of the time. The Harrington plantation still stands today, though no longer a working farm. The main house has been preserved, the Eastern Wing restored. Visitors can walk through the rooms, see the bed never slept in, read Margaret's journal, and try to understand what it meant to be hidden away for 51 years. But the room itself remains, in many ways, a mystery. The silence that surrounded Margaret's confinement for so long has been broken, but the questions the room raises have not been answered. They may never be answered. And perhaps that is the most terrifying thing of all, not the secret itself, but the realization that such secrets were possible, that families were willing to go to such extraordinary lengths to maintain them, that a person could be hidden away in plain sight, acknowledged by no one, claimed by no one, treated as if she did not exist. The bed in the Eastern Wing was never used, but it was always there, a silent testimony to the human capacity to deny reality, to maintain fictions, to prioritize reputation over humanity. And in that silence, in that empty bed, in that sealed room, there is a story that continues to haunt us, a story that asks us to consider what we might be willing to hide, what secrets we might be willing to keep, what truths we might be willing to deny in order to protect our own sense of respectability and honor. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that such things really happened? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next one.